Hi, this is Nisima, welcoming you all at Business Agility Leaders Meetup. Our today's speaker, Mike Bowler, and after attending the session, please do not forget to claim your Scrum Alliance 1 SCU. Now introducing Mike, who is a popular trainer, consultant, and value-driven coach. Traveled around the globe for training and taught on 3 continents on topics ranging from leadership to technical skill to unconscious behavior. And today, Mike will speak about psychological safety. What does the science tell us? And let's deep dive into neuroscience and psychology with Mike. Mike, come.
Thank you. Just going to share the screen here. So a little bit of context here. I am a longtime Agile coach, been doing this for a very long time. I started my Agile journey back in 1999. There may be some people on this call who've been doing it longer than me, but we'll see. Of all the things that I do as an Agile coach, there's really 3 main buckets that things fall into. One of which traditionally was my weakest area, was all of that messy people stuff. Why do people do the things they do? What motivates us? How do we get people working? And a number of years ago, I decided to get better specifically at that. What's all this people stuff? What can we do about that? And that's taken me on the craziest journey into neuroscience, psychology, hypnosis, body language, and a whole bunch of other things. And everything we're going to talk about today comes from those worlds. So specifically on psychological safety, we talk a lot about psychological safety in the Agile space, but we tend to talk in platitudes. Yes, it's good, we should do more of it. And that frustrates me because there's actually a lot that we know about psychological safety. There's a lot of things that we could be doing to improve it, but to really know what to do or why we would do it, we need to understand what's really going on. So today I want to dive in a little bit into the neuroscience of this to figure out what's going on. Well, why am I not? Sorry. There we go. So here's our agenda basically for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what psychological safety is, because again, we do tend to bandy the term around without really understanding the essence of it. We're going to talk about why we care, what's really going on in our brains. This is the neuroscience. I'm going to introduce the safety model, which is a model for looking at the neuroscience side of it. And then, although I don't think we'll have time for it, there is an exercise at the end. I don't think we'll have time for that today. Questions are welcome at any time. So at any time, if you have a question, please stop me. Although I do have an agenda and I do have things I want to get through, it's more important to me that you walk away with what you need. So feel free to stop me at any point and we'll go in whatever direction you need us to. So what does psychological safety really mean? When Amy Edmondson coined the term, she was talking about a very specific observable behavior. She was working with medical research. She was looking at the number of errors that were happening in medical situations. And she discovered that when people were feeling safe, they would speak up more about problems that they saw. And when they felt unsafe, they wouldn't speak up. And so it was an actual observable behavior. She has a TED Talk on this, which is fabulous. And if you haven't seen it yet, you should. I don't want to tell her story again today. I want to get into other interesting things. But she was talking specifically about this observable behavior. Victor Cizan wrote a really interesting paper. I'm going to give you links to everything that I talk about today. He wrote a really interesting paper in 2001 where he talks about 3 different aspects of psychological safety. And the first one is what Amy Edmondson had originally coined. It's this belief that we will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, which can be summarized as safe to act. So we feel safe, but we're feeling safe to take this behavior to act in a specific way. But if we generalize that a bit, we can look at it from a psychological perspective. And psychology says it's the ability to show and be one's true self without fear of negative consequences for self-image, status, or career. So this is more not safe to act in a certain way, but this is safety to be. I can be myself in this environment because I feel safe in that way. But there is a third way that we can look at psychological safety, a third definition that we can throw at it. And this is the neuroscience, where we're going to spend the most of today talking about. And the Neural Leadership Organization defines psychological safety as a neurological state in which we have access to our prefrontal cortex. So that's a very specific part of the brain that has to do with rational, higher level thinking, that when we have access to this, we can say that we have psychological safety. And when we do not have access to the prefrontal cortex, we do not. And that neurological state, of course, drives all the behaviors that we see in point 1 and point 2 here. So if I don't feel safe, I'm not going to act in this way. I'm not going to feel comfortable being myself. And it all has to do with this specific part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So this is Amy Edmondson's video. Again, you'll get links to everything here. If you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to take a look at that. She was talking about medical teams and that were more willing to admit that they'd made mistakes. Because very quickly she came in and she saw that some teams had very high rates of medical errors. They gave out the wrong prescriptions. They gave the wrong pills. They did things incorrectly, and other teams had not. And she was trying to determine what made higher effective teams, effectiveness in this case being patient outcome. So which teams got the patients to a better place faster. And she was expecting to find that the teams with very high error rates actually would be the same, would be poor outcomes, and the teams with very low error rates would be higher outcomes. And she found the reverse. What she found is that all teams made mistakes, but the teams that were willing to admit they made mistakes actually had higher patient outcomes. The patients survived better, they recovered faster, they had much better outcomes. So that psychological safety was the key towards getting better patient outcomes. This book is also fabulous. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do so. This is Leadership in Language, is Language by David Marquet, who talks about the cargo ship El Faro. This ship was lost at sea. It went down in the middle of a hurricane. But there's a lot to the story, because it turns out that the crew had a sense that there was something wrong. They knew there was danger. They knew that they should be turning the ship to get away. But because of the language that was being used, there was a real lack of psychological safety, and the ship ended up going down with all hands. So it's a horrifying story, but there's real lessons that we can take away from this, that if the crew had had that psychological safety, they would have been in a better place. They would have not gone into the hurricane, and they probably would have survived. So fabulous book. But why is this relevant to software development? We're typically not dealing with life or death. We're not prescribing pills or doing medications. We're not driving a cargo ship into a hurricane. So why do we care about this? Well, how is it relevant for us in the software development space? Now, I realize that sometimes we do deal with life and death. There are some of us who are writing software for pacemakers and for things like that. But generally speaking, we're not. So why is it relevant to us? Well, let's take a look at Google. Google does not build things. Well, I suppose they build autonomous cars now, but typically the software that Google is building is not life or death. But they do just realize that some of their teams significantly outperform other teams. And so back in 2015, they did this study across all other teams to find out why some teams were more effective than other teams. And they expected to find that the teams that were more effective had better tooling, they had better education, perhaps they had better people on the team. They expected to find certain combinations of things that would result in higher, more effective teams. And after going all through this and studying all different aspects, what they finally came to, and I would encourage you to read the article on this, it's quite fascinating. What they discovered was that the single most important factor towards a highly effective team was psychological safety. In fact, the top 5 items, which are all down here on the right, none of them had to do with tooling or education or anything like that. They were all those soft skills that we talk around about people. So psychological safety is that number one thing. If we have psychological safety in our teams, we will outperform a team that does not have psychological safety. And when we get into the actual neuroscience of it, you'll begin to see why that makes sense. But for now, this is why it's relevant. I want us to talk about this first before we get into the actual mechanics of what's going on in your brain. So a couple of disclaimers. First of all, the whole field of neuroscience is relatively new. If you go back 50 years, you won't even find the word neuroscience anywhere. So we are uncovering new things all the time. So as much as we know today, in 10 years, we'll probably look back at today and say, oh, all those things that we thought we knew, that was kind of cute, but in fact, we've learned new things since. So recognize that this is an evolving state. What I'm going to show you today is what we believe is true today. I'm also going to call out here that the slides are very text heavy, which is not my preferred style, because I feel that because I'm talking about neuroscience, I feel an obligation to sort of prove what I'm talking about and not just make a whole bunch of bold statements. I feel a necessity to prove what I'm talking about by referencing back to credible materials. So either published books, articles, videos, etc., from actual neuroscientists, because I am not a neuroscientist. I'm just somebody who is very excited about this topic and reads a lot about it. Okay, so let's dig into the prefrontal cortex a little bit here. So again, we're coming back to the Neuro Leadership Organization's definition of psychological safety as a neurological state in which we have access to our prefrontal cortex. So this is where we do higher level rational thinking. It overrides the emotional response. And it really is the human part of our brain. If we look at other mammals, they don't have this prefrontal cortex. They have many parts of the brain that are the same as ours, but they really don't have this piece. This is the human portion of our brain. Now, I'm oversimplifying here. There are obviously some pieces that are found in various places. But the interesting key here is that this is our higher level rational thinking. If we want to think our way through a problem analytically, rationally, we need access to the prefrontal cortex. If we don't have that, we are just reacting to what's going on around us. When the prefrontal cortex is active, it's able to override an emotional response. So if I'm in a situation where I might be fearful about something, the prefrontal cortex can help reduce that emotion so that I can start thinking again rationally. But when I am in a deeply emotional state, well, as you'll see, that begins to inhibit the prefrontal cortex. So we really need this for our best level thinking. That's the key. When we are in danger, and this is not, we're talking more than just the psychological safety here. We're talking about safety at all, because our bodies are designed for survival. When we see a potential danger around us, we will go into one of two responses. So the polyvagal theory talks about us having two different emergency responses within our bodies, these two different survival mechanisms. One is the freeze response on the right, which is the older, more primitive portion of our brain that protects us in certain ways. And the other is the mobility response, which is a much newer mammalian part of our brain that has to do with the way we respond today. So in a freeze response, we'll talk about that one first, because this is a much older response. This is common across reptiles and across all kinds of animals, whereas the mobility response is very specific to mammals. In the freeze response, we shut down. Our heart rate slows. We do all kinds of things in order to shut down. We freeze. It makes sense in a human perspective because our predators for millions of years have typically been the large cats, and they hunt by sight. In fact, most of our predators hunt by sight. So a freeze response makes a lot of sense in that context. But the problem with the freeze response is that because it's shutting down everything as much as possible, it reduces the amount of oxygen up to our brain, which inhibits our prefrontal cortex. So if we go into that freeze response and we stay there for too long, our prefrontal cortex becomes damaged. We can actually cause actual brain damage. Whereas reptiles can shut down completely for hours, sometimes days, and not have that response in the brain, mammals cannot. So a freeze response can actually be dangerous for us. The mobility response, which is fight or flight, is a different thing. So this is where when the amygdala, which is the initial part that triggers that survival mechanism, that survival response, when the amygdala gets triggered, if it activates a mobility response, it's doing that by triggering the sympathetic nervous system that then goes and does a whole bunch of things. It gets the adrenal glands going and pumping adrenaline throughout your system, getting you ready to move. Because fight or flight is not about shutting down. It's about preparing us for rapid action. We're either going to run or we're going to fight. And to do either one of those, we need to be pumping sugar into our bloodstream time so that we can get it pumped into the muscles. We're getting our adrenaline flowing. We're getting noradrenaline going in our brain to get all kinds of other things. We've got all of these things going, preparing us for rapid movement, either fighting or fleeing. And that requires a tremendous amount of energy. Well, to provide all of that energy, our brains then shut down all of the things that it considers non-essential services, which includes growth. So our fingernails stop growing when we're in a mobility response. Our hair stops growing. It shuts down a number of other things, but the one that's most interesting is that our bodies decide that one of the things that's not important in a fight or flight response is the prefrontal cortex. So it shuts it down in order to allow more energy to go towards reacting. We need to react to get out of the situation quickly. So a mobility response explicitly shuts down the prefrontal cortex, and a freeze response compromises the prefrontal cortex due to lack of oxygen. So regardless of which kind of a response you have, the prefrontal cortex is in trouble. So looking at the mobility response, again, this is our mammalian response. We've activated the sympathetic nervous system, the blood's pumping, we're getting ready, we're going to be fighting or flight. We react poorly when we're in this state. We're more likely to misread social cues. We see neutral faces as aggressive, fearful faces as angry. And then all of those things, of course, make us more susceptible to false or misleading information. So we're reacting and making very poor decisions around all of the things that we're doing. Now, remember, from an evolutionary perspective, the mobility response is only supposed to be on for a short time. It happens immediately. It gets us out of that danger. It doesn't matter if we're making poor societal decisions in that moment, because we're supposed to get out of it again quickly. But when we're talking in a workplace environment where we've got stresses like your boss giving you a deadline, we're in this state a lot, which means that we are generally far more susceptible to false or misleading information. We're misreading social clues on a regular basis. This is a real problem. We're distracted by potential dangers. So one of the interesting things is that when we're in this mobility response, our inner ear actually tunes itself to allow us more access to low frequency sounds, which would be the sound of a predator walking through the forest. That's all low frequency sound, and makes it actually harder for us to hear high frequency sound, because all of the danger is going to come from the low frequency. And so our ears actually tune themselves to amplify those low frequency sounds. So that means that if you're in a meeting and you're feeling all stressed and anxious, you'll hear very clearly somebody putting a coffee cup down on the table. But what you won't hear as clearly is human voice, because human voice is a higher frequency sound. So we are now actually less capable of following along in a business conversation because it's harder to hear those human voices. We are also less capable of effective problem solving because we're using up all of the oxygen and the glucose that we would normally use for problem solving. All of those things are being used up in order to prepare us for that mobility response. Glucose is being pumped into our muscles as opposed to going to our brains, because our muscles now need to react. Have you ever had that experience where you get a shock or a surprise and your hands shake for a little bit? What's happening in that response is that you triggered a rapid mobility response. Your body pumped all kinds of glucose into your muscles, getting you ready for fight or flight, but you didn't. You didn't move, you didn't do anything. And so now your body has to burn off all that glucose, and that's why you shake. Your body is trying to burn off glucose by shaking. So with all of this, we also tend to tire very easily. So our brain is being flooded with noradrenaline, which is like adrenaline, except it's a neurotransmitter. It's in your brain. And that helps us to really get focused on the immediate danger. But because we're so hyper-focused, we tire out very quickly. The prefrontal cortex is also a relatively new part of the brain, and it doesn't recover quite as quickly when it does get exhausted. So if we're in this constant state of feeling anxious because we've got deadlines, because we've got all these concerns around us, we're overly tired. We're focusing on the wrong things. We're focusing on low frequency sounds. We're focusing on things that are potential dangers, and we're just overwhelmed. We're very tired. Then, of course, it gets worse, because we find that as we are staying in this state longer and longer periods of time, the research is showing that the hippocampus begins to disintegrate. We find that our body gets flooded with cortisol, which really helps us when the saber-toothed tiger is coming at us, but it is not so helpful when we're in a work environment where the danger is a deadline. So that cortisol flooding our system not only makes us feel horrible, it has all of these negative side effects. It suppresses the immune system, increases blood pressure and blood sugar levels, and decreases learning ability. And then, of course, if this wasn't bad enough, if we are continuing to have that prolonged stress, the amygdala will actually grow in size and become more reactive, causing us to get into that situation just that much faster. So this is everything I've talked about so far is pretty much a bad news story. There is some good news coming, but this is all pretty much a bad news story. That the more we are in a stressed environment, the more susceptible we are to becoming more and more stressed. There's all kinds of negative health benefits to all of this. So here's some of the good news. The good news is that oxytocin, which is one of the neurotransmitters that has a lot of impact on how we react in a business conversation, oxytocin has the effect of suppressing the amygdala. The amygdala, again, being that part that initially triggers the danger. So we believe that there's some danger out there, whether it be a saber-toothed tiger or a deadline. It's a danger of some kind to us, and it triggers all of the other things. It might trigger a fight or flight. It might trigger a freeze response, but whichever it's going to trigger something. Oxytocin calms the amygdala and makes it less likely that we're going to move into that fight or flight response. Well, this is good news. Oxytocin is produced through a sense of belonging. So if we've got social bonding, and this is really hard when we're remote, but if we're in a group like this and we're talking to each other and we're sharing things, that social bonding that we're getting in there actually causes the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin then calms the amygdala, makes you less likely to go into that stress response. So we do have a really positive way of these social bonds, these groups that we're in, actually help us become less stressed. Laughter is brilliant. Laughter releases a whole bunch of positive chemicals in your brain, but the one that we care about right here is the release of oxytocin. So laughter will cause a huge release of oxytocin, which again calms the amygdala. Interestingly, it doesn't have to be real laughter. You don't have to be laughing because you find something funny. You could just get in a room all by yourself and force laughter. Just force yourself to laugh and you'll get the same reaction. The oxytocin will be generated along with all the other positive chemicals. Laughter is a tremendous thing. There are groups that do laughter yoga or laughnosis, where people will get in a room. I suppose that they're not in a room as much these days with remote work, but they get together and they force themselves to laugh, and it causes all kinds of positive reactions. Oxytocin is additionally triggered by touch. If you hug somebody, you get a shot of oxytocin. If I am petting my cat, I am getting a shot of oxytocin just from that contact with my cat. My cat, being a mammal, also gets that shot of oxytocin because this is a mammalian response. And so we're both getting oxytocin from the fact that we are having that contact of touch. So now I want to move on to the safety model, which gets a little bit deeper into this. The safety model is all written up in this book that comes from the Brain-Based Leadership Organization. Fabulous book, I do recommend it. So there's 6 specific categories that they lump everything into, and we're going to talk through each one of these and how it relates from a neuroscience perspective. First of all, I want to call it that not everybody will react to this the same way. There are 6 specific things that we all need, but different people need different levels of them. So for example, I might have a higher need for security, but less of a need for autonomy. And somebody else might be the reverse. They might have a higher need for fairness, but less of a need for security. So we need to recognize that there's no single one thing that we can do to establish more psychological safety in the environment. We have to do a lot of different things that help improve all of these situations for different people. So we're all different. There's huge amounts of variation in how we prioritize things and how the nervous system works. And if you're interested in getting deeper into that, the top quote there is from polyvagal theory. Stephen Porges is the expert on that particular one. So the key message there is there's no single right answer that's going to work for everybody. So the first one in the safety model we're going to talk about is security. And this is our brain's need for predictability. Our brain really, really needs to be able to predict what's coming up. There's some brilliant books that I'll recommend later that talk about how we have evolved to become a prediction engine. And it's all because our survival is predicated on us not just reacting to the environment, but are anticipating what's going to happen next in the environment. So we want consistency, commitment, certainty, and no change. Now, the truth is we also need novelty in different situations, and novelty sort of counteracts security. But the core thing that we need from a safety perspective is we need to know that security. We need to know what's coming. We need to be able to predict what's going to happen in our environment. And when we can't predict what's happening, we feel unsafe. And our prefrontal cortex starts to shut down. So as I just mentioned, our brains have evolved to be highly effective prediction engines. I recommend at the end 2 books by Barrett. Her work is brilliant. One of her books is the only neuroscience book that's ever made me laugh out loud. She's got a really good writing style, and she talks all about how we have evolved to be these prediction engines. It is hilarious. But we do also like some novelty in small doses. But the key thing is that if we don't have some level of predictability, security, if the environment is changing too much around us, then we feel unsafe. How we phrase our feedback or suggestions can impact how we feel about security. I'm sure we've all had that situation where the boss comes by and says, "Can I see you in my office?" I have complete uncertainty there. I don't know what's coming. It might be that my boss just wants to know, where can I go for lunch? Or it might be that I'm about to be fired. I don't know what's going on, but when my boss phrases things in that way, it makes me feel unsafe. So if we are talking to other people, we need to recognize that the words we use have a big impact on the security of the people around us. Autonomy is the next item in the safety model. We really don't like being told what to do. And I know all of you are right now are thinking, oh, I know somebody who likes to be told exactly what to do. And there are situations for that. But at a core level, we don't want to be told what to do. We want to make our own decisions and go forwards. So sometimes we do appear to want directions. We appear to want to be told exactly what the steps are. That typically is a response to the security, which was the first step, that we don't feel safe because there's too much uncertainty in our space. Once I get past that security level, I don't want to be told what to do. So when we don't have that autonomy, we can't take steps in our own directions. Again, prefrontal cortex is inhibited. We're feeling psychologically unsafe. The sort of off the topic of today, but not having autonomy also leads to all kinds of other problems around motivation and such. The 2 books down here are both brilliant. You've probably all at least heard of Dan Pink's Drive. If you haven't seen his RSA video on that, I would recommend that you go and watch it. It's a very short video that covers all the things that you would find in the book. The Self-Determination Theory is a massive book with tiny print that, if you find this fascinating, is a great book, but it's pretty dense. So then we move on to the next level in the safety model, and this is fairness. And this is really interesting. If I observe something that I perceive as being unfair, my prefrontal cortex is inhibited. And the reason that happens is because when we see something unfair, the anterior insula portion of our brain is activated, and that suppresses the prefrontal cortex. So isn't this fascinating? I don't even have to be treated unfairly myself. If I observe somebody else being treated unfairly, my prefrontal cortex is inhibited. I feel less safe. Fairness, on the other hand, gives us a reward. We've been talking all from the perspective of safety, but when we perceive things as being fair, we actually get a good shot of dopamine, which is another neurotransmitter, which is the reward chemical. When we do something that our body wants to reward us for, it gives us a shot of dopamine. So unfairness inhibits the prefrontal cortex. Fairness gives us a shot of dopamine, which makes us feel good. Then we get to esteem. Esteem is interesting because from an evolutionary perspective, our social status had a direct relation to our survival. If we were accepted by our tribe, then we were protected by our tribe. If we were ostracized by the tribe and we had to leave, then our chances of survival went down significantly. And so we are wired to be very sensitive to our social standing. So we've got a couple of studies here that something as simple as a disapproving facial expression from somebody else can trigger the amygdala more than actual fear does. So if somebody looks at you in the wrong way, they might not even be thinking about you. They might be thinking about something that happened in their own life, but they give you that disapproving stare. And now your amygdala is being triggered. And when your amygdala gets triggered, we're starting to feel unsafe. Social rejection by way of public insult or challenge has the same impact on the brain as physical pain. The study that's referenced there was actually looking at taking painkillers like ASA and using that to handle social rejection. And it was working remarkably well. So esteem and social standing are critical. If somebody feels that their social status is being threatened, they will go into a survival response. Their prefrontal cortex will be inhibited. They will perhaps lash out. So this is why we need to be very careful about how we deal with other people. And the next one is trust. We automatically distrust those people who are different from us, where we, at a high level, we often talk about us versus them, but from a psychology perspective, it's really a matter of in-groups and out-groups. So you and I might share multiple in-groups and also multiple out-groups. So there's some things where we're the same and there's other things where we're different. Our brains automatically distrust those who are different. But the interesting thing is that the prefrontal cortex, when it's active, can override this default behavior. So even though you might be different from me in many ways, when my prefrontal cortex is active, I can override all those feelings of distrust, and I can work with you in that way. When my prefrontal cortex is inhibited, I now become a little bit more paranoid about what's going on. I don't trust as easily, and this is an interesting thing. Then, of course, the prefrontal cortex itself becomes inhibited because we're feeling unsafe. Having trust, when I trust somebody implicitly, or they trust me, that actually calms the amygdala. So it goes both ways. The amygdala, the prefrontal cortex can help us get to a place of trust faster, but having that trust in the first place calms the amygdala. Interestingly enough, if you trust me, even if I don't trust you, I'm still getting the benefit of calming the amygdala. And this is because that trust triggers the release of oxytocin in both directions. So I find it fascinating that I get that shot of oxytocin when I am trusted, even if I don't trust that person in return. I find that part particularly fascinating. Stephen Covey of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People calls out how expensive trust is. When you have that low trust in a company and a relationship, it puts that hidden tax on every transaction. So everything is just that much more difficult, that much more expensive when we don't have that trust. Now, the good news about trust is that it's actually really easy to build up. And so we do a lot of things in the Agile community. We do exercises to work on building team trust. We do mob programming, for example. We might do simulations of different kinds to get people working together. So we can build trust explicitly. And when we build that trust, we're getting the oxytocin flowing, which calms the amygdala. So there's certain things that we can do in our environment. And the Agile community sort of does a number of them without actually knowing the neuroscience behind it to get people to that place where the prefrontal cortex is in a better place. So we can build trust relatively easily, whereas we can't always build the other ones as easily. It's harder to build up fairness, for example. If we've perceived something as being unfair, it's harder to fix that, whereas trust we can build quite easily. And the last one in the safety model is the fact that everybody's different. And so we have all of these different things where one person requires more of one thing and less of another thing. And so we've got all of these things going on, and it really is, it's difficult to say, just do this one thing and you'll be fine, because we are all different. All right, so now this is where we would normally be doing the exercise, but we don't have a lot of time today. So instead, I'm just going to open this to questions. And I'm going to put back up the items here so that you can see the 6 items. And once we've talked through this a little bit, then I will give you some references for reading. And every study that I've talked about so far, I'm going to give you either a link or a reference to it. So over to you. I see that there is some stuff in the chat. Questions, thoughts?
There's sorry, Mike.
Ahead.
There's several comments in there, and I just put a question in that I was kind of sitting with, but I don't want to get in the way if those other people want to speak up and make further comment on their comments in the chat. But my question was, I do appreciate when you're saying as far as trust that sort of once it's started, it can build quickly. And my question that it triggered for me anyways was, I wonder then if trust is established, but something happens that sort of violates that trust or puts that trust into question, I wonder if the same sort of momentum happens in terms of it sort of dwindling.
Absolutely. We can lose trust in a heartbeat. So yes, trust can be undone very easily, but it happens to be the one that we can build fairly quickly too, so long as there hasn't been anything that really betrayed that trust. That also ties into fairness. Typically, if we're breaking the trust, we're also doing something to break fairness.
Thank you.
So how would you use some of this? The exercise we would have done if we had a lot more time would be to just brainstorm places where you've seen some of these things in action or things that you might be able to use to make your environment better. So now that we know that people have a need for security or a need for fairness or a need for trust, how would we build that up in our environment?
Mike, I would like to chime in with something. Sometimes I notice that people already have some perspective with some other people, other concept.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of psychological safety, how you describe this one? Because when they have their own perspective very much concrete and set up, they don't want to accept anything new. In terms of trust, in terms of fairness, or maybe ego sometime came up. How do you handle, comment on this?
Well, from the perspective of what we're talking about here, the first thing I'd call out is that when people are holding on to those ideas and not considering other possibilities, that's an indication that their prefrontal cortex is not active. Because we see this in, well, current events right now in multiple countries around the world, where people are doing things that really don't seem logical. They're not thinking their way through it. They're just reacting. That's the prefrontal cortex being shut down. So what could we do with these 6 items to start building up some of that again? Could we do some exercises around trust or fairness or autonomy to get the prefrontal cortex back and active again so that people can start thinking more logically? Because when they're hanging on to their ideas and they're saying, no, this is the way it is, that's a good indication the prefrontal cortex is not active.
Yeah, thank you. I can see a question in chat box from Stephanie. Like exercise, the part of the brain that gets fed or exercised the most gets stronger. Can the PFC ever get strong enough to be the default as amygdala?
Well, the prefrontal cortex does calm the amygdala. That's one of its purposes, is that it can override the amygdala to a certain extent. But at the same time, the amygdala is our primary security. It's our primary safety mechanism. So if we have evolved to give priority to the amygdala, so even though the prefrontal cortex can calm it somewhat, when we're in that true danger, I'm walking down the path and I run across a grizzly bear, because I do live in grizzly country. When you come across a grizzly bear, I want my prefrontal cortex to shut down in that moment. I don't want to be sitting and thinking logically, oh, well, that's an interesting grizzly bear and look how large it is. No, I want to be reacting. So I want that survival mechanism to be doing the right thing in that situation. So we don't want to override it too much. We want to override it in a business context. Absolutely. So if we build up all of these things, the prefrontal cortex will be stronger. It will be more likely to calm the amygdala. You'll be less likely to go into an incorrect survival mechanism response, because that's what that's really what you're talking about. You're talking about an incorrect survival response. You know, your boss gave you a deadline and I reacted by going into survival mechanism. I went into fight or flight. Well, I don't want to go into fight or flight there, but I do want to go into fight or flight if I run into the bear. Does that help?
Yeah, Stephanie says thank you. Connie raised hand. Connie, you have something to ask or share?
Yeah, I was, hi, thank you, Mike. That's been very interesting. We've been chatting back and forth about how this ties in with the, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the whole diversity, equity, inclusion conversations that are going on now. And I was just wondering, I think you were saying, how can we work on this? I think part of it is maybe things like, you're talking about the grizzly bear. Well, that's great. Most of us probably hopefully won't encounter those in our day. But we do encounter, as you were saying, a lot of times I attended a session about the similar thing about how our brains are trained to recognize people who are similar to us in just our appearance. So I think maybe, do you think that bias training might help? Because maybe a lot of this, the insecurities that we feel sometimes are based on biases that we already have. And that, as you said, because the prefrontal cortex is our rational mind, the primitive hippocampus and amygdala, they're going to react in a certain way sometimes. Totally over that emotional response, it completely overrides your rational thought. And maybe by training, getting rid of some biases that we have, because that's where some of our emotional responses are coming from. Do you think that might help?
It absolutely does. The thing we need to recognize that if our training around diversity and all of those things are primarily rational, logical things, then the prefrontal cortex has to be active before we can even deal with it.
Yeah.
So for somebody who is just in reaction mode, those kinds of conversations don't help. What we need to do instead is build up some of these other things. Trust is a key one in that case, because the reason that we're reacting poorly around diversity is because we don't trust people who are not like us. Well, the moment we can start to build the bridges with those people, the more we can start to get more in groups. So yes, you may be different in these parts of your life, but let's find some places where we're the same. Oh, maybe we like some of the same foods. Maybe we like to do some of the same activities in our spare time. The more of those in groups that we can form with people, the more we begin to trust. And the less we have of that problem of, oh, you're not like me. Well, no, actually, you are like me in a lot of ways. You may not look like me, but we have a lot of common things. So the more in groups we can form, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, agreed. And sometimes, and my last comment is just that sometimes just because we don't look like each other, those are pretty superficial things. As you talked about, I eat chicken. How do you eat it? Everyone eats chicken pretty much. So how you cook it with what spices and stuff is different for me, but we still eat and it's still chicken. So thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Mike, we have 15 minutes left.
Okay. I will put. Okay, so all the slides that we've talked about here, I just put into the chat along with contact info from me. But there are a couple more things that I just want to call out here. And then it's just going to be open for questions for as much time as we have left. Recommended reading, these are all books that were, most were all books that we've referenced up till now. The one exception was The Worst Is Over, which is just a fabulous book around the power of language. and how the language we use is completely relevant to psychological safety, but also to things like patient outcomes. So the safety model comes from this book. This book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, is the one that made me laugh out loud. It is hilarious. Sorry, her writing style is hilarious. The subject is deep and interesting and fascinating. So there's a whole bunch of books. Here are also a whole bunch of articles that are over here. Everything from the Google to a bunch of other things around various neurotransmitters in your brain. So if you're interested in diving deep into this, I will warn you that this is a rabbit hole unlike any other. I've been digging into this stuff since 2016 now, and I am still uncovering more things almost every week than I have time to research. So it is quite the rabbit hole going deeper into this stuff. And then that's me. If I could shamelessly plug for a moment, I do have a training class coming up on Kanban. The details are there. It has nothing to do with this talk, but it's still me. So let's open it up for questions. I will stay around as long as anybody wants.
If I could deepen your rabbit hole, there actually is an ancient form of neuroscience. It's Kundalini Yoga. And there's a lot of exercises and practices that probably could be applied practically in these situations if you're talking about sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system activation, left, right nostril breathing, certain types of movements, mudras, chanting. It comes off a little culty in the beginning, but it really is ancient neuroscience, because the chants, the words, the sounds are resonating circuits in the brain. So there's a lot to be had there. Maybe if instead of having coffee breaks at work every day, we had meditation breaks of the room where people felt safe to practice whatever their practice is without discrimination. And even if it involves chanting or something like that, that could go a long way to enhance neurological activity, to say the least.
That's a really good point. Yoga, meditation, all of those things are fabulous long-term solutions for calming the amygdala. I don't tend to bring them up because they're long-term solutions. They do take time to get yourself into that state, but they're fabulous. If you do them, if you actually do the practices, your brain will calm down a lot more. You'll get to a much better place. The exercise right in the middle here, I have a workshop on reducing anxiety. That's all really quick hacks. If you're feeling anxious in the moment, there's a whole bunch of neurological hacks that you can do to just get yourself feeling better.
Mike, would you comment on the parasympathetic in relation to all this, whatever you feel is appropriate?
The parasympathetic nervous system is the other half to the sympathetic. So this is all the fight-flight response. The sympathetic nervous system gets us into that state of fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. It says, okay, the danger is over now. I'm going to take you back to a state of rest and digest, which is the opposite of fight or flight. So I'm going to take you back to that state. I'm going to slow the flow of adrenaline. I'm going to do all of the different things that are going on. I'm going to release the blood again, because when we went into fight or flight, we brought all the blood into our center, away from our fingertips, which is why our fingertips tend to go white. And the parasympathetic nervous system undoes all of that. And it says, okay, I'm going to allow the blood to go back out to the fingertips. I'm going to slow down your heart rate. I'm going to do all of these things. And it's just reversing everything. Does that help?
Sure. Thank you.
Other questions? Thoughts?
Yeah, lots of comments from Mike Spade, that great presentation. Similar comments from Mike Edward, he left for you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips on engaging the parasympathetic in work environments?
Yes, these are all in this this session right here on reducing anxiety.
Super.
So there's a lot of little things, just like, I'll give you a couple of tips. If you lift your tongue up to the roof of your mouth, it activates the vagus nerve, which is the largest single nerve in your body. It goes from your brain through all your major organs. If you can trigger the vagus nerve, it in turn will trigger the parasympathetic, which gets you back down to a calmer place. So just lifting your tongue up to the roof of your mouth. If you can stare at a spot on the wall and defocus your eyes, because when we're looking at something straight on, we're in more of a survival mechanism. But if I can switch into peripheral vision, so stare at a point in the wall and spread your awareness out as far as you can, that again activates the parasympathetic nervous system that gets you calmer. So this session here goes through a whole bunch of those little things that you can do in just a couple of minutes to get yourself back to a calmer place.
Very cool. Thank you.